In the autumn of 1823, the town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania was the kind of place where nothing truly happened. Home to barely 300 people, it sat quietly among forests and farmland, untouched by the noise of growing American cities. Travelers passed through, farmers worked their land, and families lived entire lives without locking their doors. In Millbrook, everyone knew everyone, and more importantly, everyone trusted everyone. That trust would become the town's greatest weakness. Over the course of just 3 months, 17 people died. At first, no one was alarmed. Death was not unusual in the early 19th century. Illness, accidents, and harsh winters claimed lives regularly. But something about these deaths felt off. They came too close together, too quietly, too neatly explained. And there was one detail they all shared. Every single body passed through the same place. The Hartwell Funeral Parlor. For more than 20 years, the Hartwell family had been Millbrook's caretakers of the dead. When someone passed, it was Ezekiel Hartwell who arrived with his wagon. It was Martha Hartwell who comforted the grieving. It was their sons who prepared the bodies, sealed the coffins, and oversaw burials. The Hartwells were not outsiders. They were pillars of the community, which is why no one noticed what was happening right in front of them. Millbrook itself was isolated by design. The nearest large town was more than a day's ride away. The roads were narrow, often impassable in winter. Information traveled slowly, carried by word of mouth and handwritten letters. What happened in Millbrook tended to stay in Millbrook. The town survived on farming, logging, and the steady trickle of travelers moving west. Most families lived modestly, but they lived honestly. And when tragedy struck, they turned to the Hartwells. The Hartwell family had arrived in 1801, strangers carrying modest belongings and an unusual ambition. They wanted to professionalize death. Ezekiel Hartwell, the family patriarch, claimed experience in burial practices and embalming skills still rare in rural America. At first, townspeople were wary. Outsiders always were. But Ezekiel was patient, respectful, affordable. He offered payment plans, accepted labor instead of money, buried the poor with dignity. Within a few years, suspicion gave way to gratitude. The Hartwell Funeral Parlor became indispensable. By 1823, nearly every death within a 15-mile radius passed through their hands. The funeral parlor itself stood just outside town, a 3-story stone building that seemed solid, permanent, respectable. The upper floors housed the family's living quarters. The basement was reserved for embalming and preparation. Behind the building sat a coffin barn and a small burial plot for those without family. Nothing about the place looked sinister, and that was the point. Inside the home lived Ezekiel Hartwell, his wife Martha, their sons Josiah and Caleb, their daughter Rebecca, and Martha's elderly father, Thomas Creed. Together, they presented the image of a deeply religious, hard-working family. They attended church every Sunday, donated to the poor, hosted town gatherings. Death to them was not something to be feared. It was something to be managed, and over time, something else entirely. By the fall of 1823, whispers had begun soft, uncertain, easily dismissed. Why had old Mrs. Fairchild declined so suddenly? Why had Marcus Webb died days after seeming perfectly healthy? Why did the Hartwells always insist on handling medical matters themselves? In a town built on trust, questions were dangerous things. People learned not to ask them, until one man did. Dr. 7. Samuel Harrison was not from Millbrook. He was a state-employed traveling physician, tasked with inspecting rural communities for signs of disease outbreaks. His visits were rare, often unwelcome, but legally required. When Dr. Harrison arrived in Millbrook, he did not come looking for murder. He came looking for sickness. Pennsylvania law required that bodies be available for examination during health inspections. The Hartwells welcomed him with polite smiles and open doors. Ezekiel himself guided the doctor through the funeral parlor. proudly showing modern embalming tools and spotless preparation rooms. At first, everything seemed in order. Then, Dr. Harrison examined the bodies. The first was Ella Lenana Fairchild, a 68-year-old woman, officially recorded as having died of consumption. But beneath her clothing, Dr. Harrison found bruising around the neck finger-shaped marks that did not belong to disease. The second body, Marcus Webb, showed precise puncture wounds, too controlled, too deliberate, not the marks of an accident. The third, Mary Patterson, a young woman of 26, carried traces of arsenic around her mouth and fingernails. 3 bodies, 3 contradictions, 3 lies. When Dr. Harrison questioned Ezekiel and Josiah Hartwell, their answers came quickly but not convincingly. Explanations shifted, details blurred. Their calm felt rehearsed, and something else unsettled the doctor. No one seemed surprised. As he moved through the basement, Dr. Harrison noticed large glass containers lining the walls. Inside them floated preserved human organs, hearts, lungs, pieces of tissue, some marked with symbols and handwritten notes. This was not normal embalming practice. Hidden partially behind a shelf, he glimpsed a leather-bound journal. As he stepped closer, Caleb Hartwell moved abruptly, blocking his view. The message was clear. There were things in this building he was not meant to see. As night fell, Dr. Harrison understood something terrible. The deaths in Millbrook were not accidents. They were not illness. They were part of something planned, something practiced, and he had just stepped inside. Dr. Samuel Harrison did not sleep that night. The guest room assigned to him sat just above the embalming basement. Every creak of the building echoed upward through the floorboards. The wind pressed against the stone walls, carrying with it the distant sound of trees scraping together like whispered warnings. Millbrook was quiet, too quiet. Dr. Harrison replayed the day's discoveries again and again in his mind. The bruises, the puncture wounds, the taste of arsenic he swore he could still smell in the air of the preparation room, and most of all the organs preserved with clinical precision, floating silently in glass. He had examined death his entire career, but this was different. This was not decay. This was study. By morning, the doctor knew one thing for certain. If he left Millbrook without answers, he might never get them, and neither would anyone else. At dawn, he began quietly asking questions. Not accusations, just observations. How long had Mrs. Fairchild been ill? Had Marcus Webb complained of pain before his death? Was Mary Patterson truly sick, or simply unlucky? The answers came hesitantly. Neighbors exchanged glances. Voices dropped. Stories contradicted one another. And beneath every response was the same uneasy truth. The Hartwells had been present before nearly every death. Sometimes days before, sometimes hours. One woman, Sarah Peaton, finally spoke. Her hands trembled as she described her mother's final weeks. How Martha Hartwell had visited daily, bringing warm soup and gentle prayers. How her mother weakened rapidly afterward. How the funeral arrangements had already been discussed before death came. At the time, Sarah had been grateful. Now, she felt sick. Rumors, Dr. Harrison realized, had always existed. They had simply never been allowed to breathe. Back at the funeral parlor, the Hartwells watched him carefully. Every movement, every pause. Their politeness never cracked, but it tightened. That afternoon, while Ezekiel distracted him with ledgers and burial records, Dr. Harrison noticed the journal again. This time, he was closer. Its leather cover was worn smooth by years of handling. Inside were names, dates, notes, not prayers, not condolences, observations, subject compliant. Physical decline accelerated. Cause staged successfully. Dr. Harrison's blood ran cold. This was not a record of death. It was a record of murder. Before he could read further, Josiah's hand slammed the book shut. His eyes held no anger, no panic, only calculation. That night, someone knocked softly on Dr. Harrison's door. It was Thomas Creed, Martha Hartwell's father was a frail man, stooped with age and sickness. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "They will kill you," he said. Then he told Dr. Harrison everything. The Hartwells had not started as killers. They had started as grave robbers. Bodies sold quietly to medical schools. Bones harvested. Organs studied. Profit made in silence. But accidents happened. A traveler woke too early. A victim fought back. A dose was miscalculated. Cover-ups became necessities. Necessity became method. Method became habit. Over time, the family learned something terrifying. Murder was easier than hiding it. They selected carefully: the elderly, the isolated, the poor. Those with no one to ask questions. Deaths were spaced. Symptoms mimicked disease. Grief did the rest. Martha poisoned. Ezekiel planned. Josiah documented. Caleb enforced. Even Rebecca, the youngest, learned to listen, to observe, to identify who would not be missed. The journal listed more than 40 victims, and that was only what had been written down. Creed confessed something else. He had been poisoned too, not to kill him but to test him. He had survived by countering the symptoms slowly, pretending to weaken while gathering courage. Now, he was ready to help Dr. Harrison expose them. The plan was desperate. On Sunday, the Hartwells would attend church. Creed would remain behind, feigning illness. Dr. Harrison would access the hidden chamber Creed described sealed behind the basement wall. What they would find there, Creed warned, would haunt him forever. Sunday came. Church bells rang. The family left, and Dr. Harrison unlocked the door beneath the funeral parlor. Behind it lay a chamber untouched by sunlight. Shelves lined the walls, hundreds of preserved organs, each labeled with notes on reaction, resistance, failure. Anatomical drawings covered the stone, diagrams of pain, of death, and the journal complete this time, detailed, precise, remorseless. Then Dr. Harrison heard footsteps above. The Hartwells had returned early. There was no time. He ran. Through a tunnel carved beneath the parlor, into a cavern where the earth itself had been hollowed out. Bodies lay everywhere. Dozens, some buried, some arranged. Trophies. The family had done this before. Others had come looking. Others had never left. Dr. Harrison-esque aped into the woods, bleeding, breathless, hunted. Dr. Samuel Harrison ran until his lungs burned. Branches tore at his coat. Thorns ripped into his skin. The forest behind the Hartwell Funeral Parlor was dense, ancient, and unforgiving. Yet it offered the only protection he had left. He did not look back. He already knew they were searching. The Hartwells were not panicked. They were practiced. Their voices carried through the woods in calm, measured calls, too calm for a family discovering betrayal. This was not the first time someone had tried to uncover the truth. Dr. Harrison stumbled into a shallow ravine and buried himself beneath wet leaves and mud. From there, he watched lantern lights sweep the trees like slow-moving predators. One of them laughed quietly. They were confident he would not escape. By dawn, Dr. Harrison was miles away, collapsing at the edge of a trading road. A farmer took him in, never knowing how close death had followed him from Millbrook. But the danger was not over. Because truth, doctor, Harrison would soon learn, was not enough. Weeks later, he returned not to the Hartwell parlor, but with warrants, marshals, and sworn testimony. He carried notes, sketches, copied entries from the journal burned into his memory. He expected outrage. He expected arrests. Instead, he found resistance. Millbrook closed ranks. The townspeople refused to testify. They questioned his sanity. They defended the Hartwells as pillars of kindness. Mothers who had buried children stood beside the funeral home and wept not for justice, but for reputation. The sheriff hesitated. The judge delayed. And in that hesitation, the Hartwells vanished. By the time authorities forced entry into the funeral parlor, it was empty. The basement had been scrubbed, shelves smashed, journals burned. The hidden chamber collapsed deliberately, sealing secrets behind stone and earth. Thomas Creed was gone. No body was found. Only blood. The town said nothing. Within weeks, the story was officially labeled unsubstantiated. Records were sealed. Dr. Harrison's report was archived and forgotten. Millbrook returned to its routines, but something had broken. People locked doors now. Neighbors watched one another. Trust had died. Dr. Harrison did not let it go. For the next 20 years, he followed whispers. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, always the same pattern. A respected funeral home, unexplained deaths, rapid burials, communities that refused to look too closely. He arrived too late every time, until Oregon. In 1847, a sheriff investigating a family called the Caldwells uncovered a journal. Different names, same handwriting, same methods, same cold language. Under pressure, Ezekiel Caldwell confessed they were the Hartwells. They had moved west as America expanded, hiding behind grief, religion, and respectability. Over 3 decades, they admitted to more than 120 murders across 8 states. Men, women, travelers, the forgotten. When asked why, Ezekiel showed no emotion. People trust the dead, he said, and those who care for them. The executions were public, the confessions sealed, but many questions remained unanswered. How many more were never recorded? How many towns chose silence? How many learned nothing? Millbrook itself faded from maps by 1860. Forest reclaimed the land. The funeral parlor collapsed. The basement remains sealed to this day. Dr. Samuel Harrison died, an old man. His notes survived, his warnings ignored, and his story reminds us of one terrifying truth. Behind him, Millbrook remained silent. The executions of the Hartwell family were meant to close the chapter. In December of 1847, crowds gathered beneath a cold Oregon sky as Ezekiel and Martha Hartwell stood on the gallows. There were no final pleas, no tears, only silence. Witnesses later said Ezekiel stared forward as if already bored with death, like a man who had long ago stopped seeing it as something sacred. Josiah followed soon after. Caleb died behind prison walls. Rebecca, once a quiet child who smiled at neighbors, spent her final years insisting she had been shaped by fear, obedience, and blood long before she understood choice. But closure never truly came. Because even in confession, the Hartwells left behind more questions than answers. They spoke casually of towns that were never named, of apprentices trained to continue the work, of methods passed on quietly, disguised as professional knowledge. They hinted that their crimes had inspired others, men who learned how easily grief could be manipulated, how respectability could become armor. And then, the record stopped. Back east, Millbrook disappeared. By 1860, the town was abandoned. No official reason was ever recorded. Census entries faded. Roads went unused. Forests swallowed homes, fields, and memory itself. Travelers passed through without knowing they walked over buried secrets. The Hartwell Funeral Parlor collapsed slowly, stone by stone. Its basement, never fully excavated, remains sealed beneath earth and roots. Some say the cave system beneath it was never mapped. Others say bones were found decades later, quietly reburied without ceremony. No marker stands there now, only trees. Dr. Samuel Harrison spent the rest of his life warning anyone who would listen. In letters, journals, and government petitions, he wrote about patterns, about how evil survives by blending in, about how institutions built on trust can become the perfect hiding place for cruelty, about how communities, when faced with horror, often choose comfort over truth. Most ignored him. Some mocked him. A few listened. Modern criminologists still study his notes, preserved in federal archives. They recognize what he saw before anyone else did, that serial crime does not begin with violence. It begins with permission, with silence, with the decision not to ask difficult questions. The Hartwell case forced America to confront something deeply uncomfortable. That monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they dress well. Sometimes they pray loudly. Sometimes they bury your dead. And sometimes they are thanked for it. This story is not just about the past. It is about how easily trust can be weaponized, how systems meant to protect the vulnerable can be turned against them, and how history hides its darkest chapters, not because they are unknown, but because they are inconvenient. So the next time a place feels too respectable to question, remember Millbrook, remember the Hartwells, and remember that vigilance is not suspicion, it is responsibility. Because the most dangerous evil is not the one that announces itself.